My name is Eleanor, and at 70 years old, I've waited far too long to tell this story. For decades, I've kept it hidden inside me, like a wound no one should see. But now, with my hair completely white and my hands marked by time, I feel the moment has come, not out of vengeance or anger, simply for the truth. What wounded me most deeply in life wasn't my husband, Daniel. It was my mother-in-law, Margaret. Not because she treated me poorly or shouted at me. No, Margaret knew. She knew what happened within our home. And she chose silence. Before continuing with the story, please click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and comment where you are watching from. Your help is very important. I grew up in a small town in rural Texas where girls learn early to lower their heads and endure, where the good family name comes before happiness, where if a husband humiliates his wife, the blame falls on her for not being good enough. I was 17 when I met Daniel. He was 10 years older, working at his father's hardware store, always dressed in immaculate shirts. Everyone said he was a good catch. I didn't love Daniel, but in those days, no girl dreamed of love. We dreamed of a home, a family, security, and Daniel offered me all of that. We married in a small church, under the proud gaze of our parents. On our first night in the new house, Margaret left me a tray with warm milk and cookies. She didn't say a word, just looked at me with those gray eyes, cold as stone. She was a silent woman, always dressed in black, though her husband was still alive. Out of respect for life's sufferings, she would say. With time, I understood. The black was more than mourning. It was armor. At first, I thought she was merely observing me, wanting to know if I would be a good wife for her son. But there was something harder in that vigilance, a constant judgment. Daniel was gentle in the early months. Then came the changes, the harsh words, the orders. The first slap came because of a dinner that was too salty. I apologized. I was always taught that a respectable woman doesn't confront, that if he gets angry, it's because she failed. If Margaret said nothing, if no one defended me, perhaps, I thought, the problem was me. And so passed months, years, children, humiliations, nights locked outside the bedroom. And Margaret, who heard, saw, felt, never said a word. Once Margaret noticed a bruise on my arm while I was hanging clothes on the line. She looked and only commented, "It's going to be windy today. Be careful not to lose the laundry." That phrase destroyed me more than any shout could have. I continued enduring, out of fear, out of shame, for my children. Because that's what they expected from a good wife. My own mother told me once, leaving church, "Marriage is a cross, and crosses are not abandoned." Daniel was a tyrant at home, and Margaret, with her cold silence, reinforced my prison. She never insulted me, never raised a hand to me, but with her eyes, her silences, her prayers for the family honor, she helped keep me on the ground. When my oldest son, still small, asked why his father locked me in the kitchen, I realized that even though I tried to hide it, the children saw everything. I tried talking to my mother, to the pastor. Nothing. The words were always the same. Be strong. Endure. I spent years without color, without voice, living only for my children and for a reputation that no longer made sense. Sometimes Margaret prayed aloud at night, but never for me. Always for the family, for the name. I began to write in secret. I wrote everything I felt, so I wouldn't forget who I was. One day, my daughter, then a teenager, found my diary. She read it, hugged me, and said, "Mom, I don't want to live like this." And that ignited something within me. Margaret fell ill. Bone cancer. Even at the end, she wanted to control everything. The funeral, the coffin, the dress. On her deathbed, she told me, "You've endured well, Eleanor. You never embarrassed us. Your mother would be proud." And then she died. That wasn't praise. It was the final sentence. Without her, the house grew even colder. Daniel drank more, shouted more, And when I saw my son treating a girlfriend to the way his father treated me, I knew that if I didn't do something, the chain would never break. The cold winter mornings in Texas have a certain stillness that feels like holding your breath. That particular January morning, I remember staring at my reflection in the bathroom mirror, barely recognizing the woman looking back at me. The bruise under my right eye was turning yellowish green. Daniel had thrown a book across the room 3 days ago when dinner wasn't ready on time. He hadn't aimed for me, he later insisted. It was just unfortunate I happened to be in the way. Margaret had seen the bruise yesterday when she came by with her weekly casserole. Her eyes lingered on my face for just a moment before she said, "The Hendersons are having their anniversary party next week. You might want to use more makeup." Then she placed the casserole on the counter and started arranging my kitchen towels, which apparently weren't folded correctly. That morning, as I applied concealer carefully over the bruise, I heard my daughter Lisa's voice from the hallway. She was 15 now, with my dark hair and Daniel's stubborn chin. But there was something in her that was entirely her own, a fierceness I had once possessed and lost somewhere along the way. "Mom," she called through the door. "Can I talk to you?" When I opened the door, she was clutching my diary to her chest, the small leather-bound book I kept hidden between the mattress and box spring, my private sanctuary of words. "I found this," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. I know I shouldn't have read it, but her eyes filled with tears. Is this really how it's been? All these years? Something inside me crumbled and rebuilt itself in that moment. Seeing my pain reflected in my daughter's eyes was like looking into a mirror that finally showed the truth. "Lisa," I said, taking her hands in mine, "I'm sorry you had to read that." "Don't apologize," she said with surprising fierceness. "Not for this. Not ever for this." She squeezed my hands tightly. "Mom, I don't want to live like this, and I don't want you to live like this either. For years I had endured for my children. I thought staying was protecting them, but in that moment I realized my silence was teaching them something far worse than I had imagined." That evening Margaret called. Daniel was out at the bar, as he often was on Thursdays. Her voice sounded thinner over the phone, frailer somehow. "Eleanor," she said without preamble, "I need to see the doctor tomorrow. Daniel's too busy. You'll drive me." Not a question. Never a question. "Of course," I replied automatically. There was a pause. Then, "The doctor says it might be serious this time." Something in her voice made me sit down. For all our years together, for all the silent complicity, Margaret was still family, still the grandmother of my children. "I'll be there at 9, I said. "Wear something respectable," she responded, and hung up. That night I wrote in my diary again. But this time, instead of just recording my pain, I found myself writing something new, a plan. The doctor's office was sterile and cold, much like Margaret herself. She sat ramrod straight in the plastic chair, her black dress crisp and unwrinkled despite the hour-long wait. I fidgeted beside her, leafing through outdated magazines while stealing glances at her profile. Even in illness, she maintained her rigid composure. "Mrs. Harper?" The nurse appeared at the door, chart in hand. "The doctor will see you now." Margaret stood, smoothing imaginary wrinkles from her dress. "Wait here," she instructed me, as if I were a child. But something strange happened then. The doctor, a kind-faced man with salt and pepper hair, appeared behind the nurse. "Actually, Mrs. Harper, you might want your daughter-in-law to join us." "She's not necessary," Margaret said firmly. The doctor smiled gently. "I think she might be. For the drive home, at least." I followed them into the office, maintaining a respectful distance. The doctor's words were clinical but clear. Metastatic bone cancer. Advanced. Treatment options limited. Perhaps 6 months. Margaret received the news with the same stoicism she applied to everything else in life. Only her knuckles, white against the black fabric of her dress, betrayed any emotion. "I'll make the necessary arrangements," she said, as if discussing a dinner party instead of her own death. "I want to be buried next to my husband. The black casket, not the mahogany one they tried to sell us for Henry, and my navy dress, not the black one. Navy is more appropriate for spring." The doctor looked bewildered. "Mrs. Harper, there are treatments we can try. Pain management at the very least." "I know my own mind," she interrupted. "Now, if there's nothing else." On the drive home, silence filled the car like another passenger. Margaret stared straight ahead, her profile etched against the passing landscape. It wasn't until we turned onto Maple Street that she finally spoke. "Eleanor," she said, her voice startlingly soft, "do you think I've been a good mother to Daniel?" The question caught me off guard. In 15 years, Margaret had never asked for my opinion on anything. "I think," I said carefully, "you've loved him the way you knew how." She made a sound. Not quite a laugh, not quite a sob. "That's a diplomatic answer. It's the truth. My mother," she began, then stopped, started again. "My mother used to say that a woman's duty is to her family name. Above all else." She turned slightly, and for the first time I saw something like uncertainty in those gray eyes. "Henry wasn't always kind to me. Did you know that?" My hands tightened on the steering wheel. "I didn't. No one did. That was the point." She turned back to the window. "He broke 3 of my ribs once. I told everyone I fell down the stairs. And do you know what my mother said when I confided in her?" I shook my head, though she wasn't looking at me. She said, "Margaret Ann, you made your bed. Now lie in it with dignity." She smoothed her dress again. So I did. We pulled into her driveway, the weight of her confession hanging between us. Before she got out, she placed her hand briefly on mine, the first time she had ever willingly touched me. "You've endured well, Eleanor," she said. "Better than I did." As I watched her walk to her front door, straight-backed and solitary, I realized that Margaret hadn't been just my jailer. She had been a prisoner herself, keeping me captive within the same walls that had confined her. Margaret's illness progressed more rapidly than anyone expected. By spring, she was confined to her bed, the cancer consuming her from the inside out. I visited her daily, driven by a complicated mixture of duty, pity, and something else I couldn't quite name. Perhaps it was understanding. Daniel rarely visited his mother. "Too depressing," he said before heading to the bar. Our son, Michael, now 20 and studying engineering in Austin, came home occasionally for weekend visits. His relationship with his grandmother had always been formal, distant, but he sat dutifully by her bedside, talking awkwardly about his classes while she nodded with regal approval. It was during one of these visits that Margaret asked to speak with me alone. Michael shot me a grateful look before escaping to the kitchen. When we were alone, Margaret gestured weakly to the drawer of her bedside table. "There's something in there," she whispered, her voice thin as paper. "For you." Inside the drawer was a small leather-bound journal, not unlike my own. The pages were yellowed with age, the handwriting precise and controlled, like everything else about Margaret. "Read it," she said. "Not now. When I'm gone." I slipped the journal into my purse, questions bubbling up inside me. But Margaret had already closed her eyes, signaling the end of our conversation. That night, after Daniel had passed out in his recliner, a half-empty bottle of whiskey at his side, I sat at my kitchen table and opened Margaret's journal. The first entry was dated May 12th, 1945, the day after she married Henry Harper. As I read through the pages, a different Margaret emerged. Young, hopeful, then gradually beaten down by a marriage not so different from my own. Henry's rages, the public charm and private cruelty, the silence of those who must have known, her own mother's cold advice to endure, to protect the family name at all costs. One entry in particular stopped my breath. November 3rd, 1954. Daniel saw Henry hit me today. I told him Daddy was just upset, that sometimes grown-ups get angry. I saw something change in my son's eyes. God forgive me, but I'm teaching him the wrong things, and I don't know how to stop. I closed the journal, my hands trembling. The chain of silence and violence stretching back through generations, mother to child, husband to wife, a terrible inheritance passed down like an heirloom. The next day, Margaret seemed weaker, her breathing labored. As I adjusted her pillows, she caught my wrist with surprising strength. "Did you read it?" she asked. I nodded. "Then you understand." Her eyes, still sharp despite the illness ravaging her body, held mine. "I knew what Daniel was doing to you. I saw it all, just like my mother saw what happened to me." She took a shuddering breath. "I told myself I was protecting the family, but I was protecting myself from having to admit that I failed him. Failed you." Tears slid down her hollow cheeks. For the first time, she looked her age, older even. "It's too late for me to change," she whispered. "But it's not too late for you, Eleanor. For your children." I sat beside her bed until she fell asleep, her confession hanging in the air between us. On the drive home, I found myself crying. For Margaret, for myself, for all the women who had endured in silence. When Lisa came home from school that afternoon, I hugged her tightly, breathing in the scent of her hair. "Mom," she asked, pulling back to look at me with concern. "Is everything okay?" "Not yet," I told her honestly. "But it will be." Margaret died on a Tuesday. Rain pattered against the windows of her bedroom as she took her final breath, her hand clutched in mine. In death, her face relaxed, the stern lines softening until she looked almost peaceful, almost young. Daniel handled the funeral arrangements mechanically, more irritated by the inconvenience than grieved by the loss. The service was small. Margaret hadn't been one for making friends. The pastor spoke of her dedication to family values, her quiet strength, her unwavering faith. I sat in the front pew, my children beside me, wondering if anyone truly knew the woman we were burying. After the funeral, relatives and neighbors gathered at our house, bringing casseroles and condolences. I moved through the rooms like a ghost, serving coffee, accepting sympathetic touches on my arm, playing the role of the dutiful wife and daughter-in-law, one last time. As the last guests were leaving, my cousin Judith from Austin pulled me into a tight hug. "You know you can always come to me," she whispered in my ear. "Any time. For anything." She pressed a piece of paper into my palm, her address and phone number. I nodded, tucking it quickly into my pocket before Daniel could see. That night, Daniel drank more heavily than usual. Grief, perhaps, or just the release of obligation. He stumbled up to bed around midnight, leaving me alone in the kitchen with the remains of the day. Dirty dishes, half-eaten food, the persistent smell of flowers beginning to wilt. As I cleaned, I thought about Margaret's journal, about her final confession, about the chain of silence and suffering that linked us across generations. I thought about my daughter Lisa's face when she found my diary, about my son Michael, who flinched whenever his father raised his voice, who had recently started dating a sweet, soft-spoken girl named Emily. I thought about how, last week, I had seen Michael raise his voice to Emily over something trivial, how his posture, his tone, had echoed Daniel's so precisely it made me nauseous. And I knew, with sudden clarity, that I couldn't wait any longer. Margaret's death had severed something, an invisible thread that had kept me bound to this life of quiet desperation. There would never be a perfect time, never a moment without risk. But if I didn't act now, the pattern would continue. My children would carry these scars into their own relationships, passing them down like some terrible inheritance. After the dishes were done, I went upstairs and pulled out my suitcase from the back of the closet. I packed methodically. Practical clothes, toiletries, my diary, the small amount of cash I'd been secretly saving from grocery money, Margaret's journal, family photographs, but only those of me with the children. Nothing that would remind me of Daniel. I wrote 3 letters, one to Daniel, brief and without apologies, one to Michael at college, explaining as best I could, and one to Lisa, who would find it in the morning after I was gone. I waited until the house was completely silent, until Daniel's snores rumbled from the bedroom. Then I carried my suitcase to the car, started the engine, and drove away from the only life I had known as an adult. The night was dark, but the highway stretched out before me, clear and empty. For the first time in decades, I felt something unfamiliar stirring in my chest. It took me several miles to recognize it. Hope. The small apartment in Austin became my sanctuary. One bedroom, a tiny kitchen, windows that let in streams of sunlight. My cousin Judith had helped me find it, along with a job at a local alteration shop where the owner, a kind-eyed woman named Rosa, didn't ask too many questions about the nervous 50-something woman with nimble fingers and downcast eyes. The first months were the hardest. I jumped at loud noises, apologized constantly, struggled to make even the smallest decisions without fear. But slowly, day by day, I began to reclaim myself. I planted geraniums on the small balcony. I painted the bathroom yellow. I learned to enjoy the sound of my own footsteps in an empty apartment, the luxury of preparing only the foods I liked, the freedom of falling asleep without fear. Daniel called once, drunk and raging. I hung up and unplugged the phone. He never came looking for me. Perhaps his pride wouldn't allow it. Or perhaps, in some corner of his heart, he knew he had no right to demand my return. Lisa visited first, bringing her warmth and fierce hugs. She stayed for a weekend, sleeping on my pull-out couch, helping me arrange my new life. Before she left, she held my face between her hands and said, "I'm so proud of you, Mom." Michael was harder. He didn't visit for nearly 6 months, his anger and confusion keeping him away. When he finally appeared at my door, his face was drawn, his eyes troubled. "Why didn't you leave sooner?" he asked, sitting stiffly on my couch. "Why did you stay so long?" "For you," I said simply. "For your sister. I thought I was protecting you." He shook his head. "You weren't protecting us. You were teaching us." The truth of his words stung, but I couldn't deny them. "I know that now," I said. "That's why I finally left." We talked for hours that day. Painful, necessary conversations about patterns and choices and the legacy of silence. Before he left, he hugged me tightly and whispered, "I broke up with Emily." "Why?" I asked, pulling back to search his face. "Because I saw myself becoming him," he said simply. "And I never want to be that man." A year after I left, I joined a support group for women who had experienced domestic violence. Sitting in a circle of strangers who understood exactly what I had lived through was both terrifying and liberating. One evening, after sharing part of my story, a young woman approached me, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "My mother lives with a man like your husband," she said. "She won't leave. Says it's too late, that she's too old to start over." I took her hands in mine. "Tell her it's never too late to reclaim your life. Tell her Eleanor said so." Over the years, my small apartment has become a gathering place. For my children, for new friends, for women seeking the courage to make their own escapes. I keep Margaret's journal on my bookshelf beside my own. 2 testaments to what happens when silence becomes complicity, and what can happen when that silence is finally broken. Recently, Michael brought home a new girlfriend, a vibrant artist with a quick laugh and strong opinions. Watching them together, the mutual respect, the easy equality, I felt a weight I hadn't even realized I was still carrying finally lift from my shoulders. The chain was broken. Now, at 70, my hair is fully white, my hands marked by time and work, but my spirit is younger than it was at 30, at 40, at 50. I stand taller. I speak my truth. I plant my geraniums and watch them bloom, red and defiant, against the Texas sky. Sometimes I visit Margaret's grave. I leave flowers and whisper, "You couldn't protect me, but I learned to protect myself." And then I walk away, head high, into the light of my own choosing. Because at 70, I finally learned the lesson that should have been taught to me, to Margaret, to all of us. From the beginning, we are not meant to be silent. We are not meant to endure abuse for the sake of appearances. We are not meant to carry the weight of other people's violence. And it's never, ever too late to save yourself. If you're reading this and recognize yourself in my story, know that you don't have to wait decades like I did. There are people ready to help you right now. Make that call. Pack that bag. Take that first step toward freedom. Your future self is waiting for you on the other side of fear, and I promise you, she's worth fighting for. Break the chain today, because everyone deserves a life lived in full color, not in shadows. The time to reclaim your life is now.